Welcome to the panel on legal and regulatory environments, policies that help or hinder women's advancement in STEM. I'm pleased to be moderating this panel webinar for this important summit organized by the Asia Foundation in partnership with the United States Department of State and the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, among other partners. My name is Karen Marrongelle. I am the Assistant Director of the U.S. National Science Foundation for the Directorate of Education and Human Resources. The National Science Foundation is an independent federal agency created by Congress in 1950 to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. In this session, we will describe some specific examples of how policies and laws have impacted women in STEM, and we will also touch on the norms that in some cases are as or more powerful forces for women pursuing advancement in STEM. You will hear about some best and promising practices. These, of course, need to be translated to one's own context. If anyone is having issues with WebEx, we have a WebEx representative who can support you. Feel free to enter requests into the Q&A box at any time. To chat and exchange ideas with other participants during this session, visit the STEM Trilateral Slack group, which you will find in the chat. Finally, if you need interpretation services, please view the chat for additional information. Our discussion today focuses on policies that help or hinder women's advancement in STEM. Policies at times lead change and at times lag behind or respond to societal or social change. Policy and law are also situated in economic and social realms and intersect with individuals, organizations, and communities. Policy can sometimes leave out the nuances that women face. Sometimes policies can only cover privileged women or women of a particular class, so we do need to keep in mind those gaps. Finally, as our world continues to address the health, economic, and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, our discussions here today are shaped by the differential effects of COVID-19 on women. Before we get started with our panel discussion, I'd like to ask the audience two questions. You will see these questions with multiple choice answers appear on your screen. Next slide, please. Please select only one answer. Please answer now, as the poll will close in about 1 minute. The questions are, first, from which country are you joining us? Japan, the Republic of Korea, the United States, or other? And second, what has impacted STEM-related policies, laws, and regulations the most? Changing social norms, advocacy campaigns, government commitments and initiatives, or top tech companies? We'll give you a moment to answer the poll questions. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists who will help us to answer the question, how can government, companies, and academia create policies to encourage the advancement of women in STEM fields in our three respective countries? From the United States, we have Tea Trumbic, a program manager for the Women, Business, and the Law Project in the World Bank's Development Economics Vice Presidency. Tea leads a dynamic team to produce data that measures how the law impacts women's economic opportunities in 190 economies. From South Korea, we have Professor So-Young Kim, the director of the Korea Policy Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the project coordinator of the establishment of Kenya CASTE project at Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology in South Korea. And from Japan, we have Kathy Matsui, Vice Chair of Goldman Sachs Japan, Co-Head of Macro Research in Asia, and Chief Japan Equity Strategist. Kathy is a member of the Asia Pacific Management Committee and Goldman Sachs Japan Company Executive Committee. As the presenters are speaking, we encourage you to put your comments and questions in the Q&A box. Taya will kick us off with the first presentation.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you calling in from all over the world. It was only 50 years ago that women's role in the economy really began to change. After striking social and industrial movements throughout the 20th century, women increasingly joined the formal labor force. As the world changed around them, more and more women became employees and entrepreneurs. Today, women contribute 40% of global income per capita, and the businesses that they own and operate actually grow faster than those owned and operated by men. When it comes to women in STEM, the numbers are much lower. Moving on to the next slide, please. At the World Bank Group, we believe that no country can achieve its full potential without the equal participation of men and women in all fields. Globally, countries are losing trillions of dollars in wealth because of differences in lifetime earnings between men and women. And we've found that greater gender equality means a country is associated with better education and health, higher per capita income, faster and more inclusive economic growth, and a greater international competitiveness. This is an issue today still in Japan, Korea, and the United States. Recent IMF research concludes that if Korea was able to equalize the percentage of women and men in the labor force by 2035, it would see real GDP growth of 7%. This is equal to what Korea spends on healthcare, so it's not an insignificant amount. And with the pandemic and increased childcare needs as schools and daycare shut down, we are seeing more and more women leaving the labor force. In the United States, more than 860,000 women dropped out of the labor force in September alone, and that's 4 times more than men. This can have devastating effects on women in STEM. Next, I would like to talk about some of these effects. We've heard stories about the impact of some of these inequalities in the STEM field. In the United States, fewer women participating in STEM has impacted our ability to make new scientific discoveries and design better technology. The limited involvement of female scientists and engineers, for example, came at a great cost in the first generation of airbags. A predominantly male group of engineers tailored them to adult male bodies, resulting in avoidable deaths of women and children. In China, several universities refused to admit too many women for mining and engineering degrees. Women would not be able to carry heavy mining equipment, they said, and they would not be able to escape the mine as quickly in an emergency. Similar controversy happened in Japan last year, as it was discovered that there was systematic bias against female students at the Tokyo Medical University because of a belief that women will leave the medical profession once they have children and get married. Also a story of a female engineer in Australia who was unable to find work because mine owners faced significant fines if women were caught working underground. She later went to Papua New Guinea, where she became the country's first female underground mining engineer. In many cases, the problems that women face can be traced back to the law. The reality is that all over the world, laws are still hindering women's economic participation, constraining their ability to make economic decisions. Next, I will tell you how women business in the law comes in. Over the last 10 years, our project has presented a unique data set that measures progress towards gender equality in the world of work. The data and research identify potential areas where more work is needed so that women can have equality of opportunity when it comes to getting jobs and starting businesses. Women Business in the Law benchmarks 190 economies, measuring discriminatory laws and regulation in 8 areas following the stages of a woman's working life. We start with the basics of mobility, where we look at women's freedom of movement. We then move to the workplace, pay, marriage. You have the 8 of them here. I won't go through all of them because we have very little time. But what I would really like to focus on is 3 of these areas that I believe are directly associated with women's ability to succeed in STEM fields: workplace, pay, and parenthood. In the next few slides, I will give you some more specific examples. For example, workplace protections can facilitate women's ability to secure and sustain employment. Legal protections, such as gender-based non-discrimination in employment, can encourage the entry of women into the workforce. Discrimination can be rampant in STEM industries and is often tied to gender roles. Pregnancy, maternity, and caretaking responsibilities make it more difficult for women than men to keep up with the demands of certain sectors. For example, in mining, working at remote work sites, unsociable work hours, and overtime often with very few childcare options. In instances where women do manage to overcome these obstacles, there's obstacles associated with being a mother and working in extractive industries. And they often find that discrimination is entrenched, even in the tools of the trade. Safety gear, mining equipment, and sanitary facilities are not designed for women, presenting yet another obstacle to women's equal participation. Women Business in the Law finds that in 10 countries, discrimination based on gender and employment is not prohibited. Sexual harassment in male-dominated STEM fields can also be an issue. Sexual harassment can undermine a woman's economic empowerment and career prospects. Like discrimination, it can have physical and psychological impacts, lead to productivity reduction, higher turnover and absenteeism, and cause a decrease in returns and profitability. However, 50 countries have yet to enact legislation tackling this issue, and Japan is one of these countries. This is really a shame because Women Business in the Law has found that where there are laws on sexual harassment at work, women are more likely to have majority ownership in firms. Governments enacting such laws are investing directly in economic growth, as women-owned businesses grow faster than those owned by men. As millions of women continue to share their experiences of sexual harassment, a newfound commitment to implementing such legislation could arise. The next area I would like to talk about is pay, and specifically job restrictions. Research estimates that eliminating barriers that prevent women from working in certain sectors or occupations could increase labor productivity by as much as 25% in some countries, simply by increasing women's labor force participation. Yet in many countries, women are forbidden from performing certain jobs. You can see some examples here. All of these fields require dedicated STEM professionals to be carried out successfully. In Japan and Korea, for example, women are legally forbidden from working in mining. Obstacles such as these, stemming from a desire to protect women and their reproductive functions, are pervasive. In the United States as well, Mueller versus Oregon of 1908 set a precedent for the prevention of women's maternal gender roles. By rescinding some of their contractual liberties, the Supreme Court solidified the idea that women must be dependent on men, triggering the enactment of law purported to protect women from the hazards of paid work. Though such laws were eventually repealed in the United States and ruled unconstitutional, 90 other countries in all regions of the world still have laws preventing women from working in specific jobs. Not being able to work in high-paying jobs such as those found in mining, construction, or energy sectors leads to occupational segregation and a wider gender wage gap. For example, depending on the life cycle of an oil, gas, or mining operation, different categories of jobs are created. In exploration, construction, development, or production, which are often gender segregated, men for construction and machine operations, women in administration, catering, and cleaning. For women to access more and better jobs in STEM industries, job restrictions must be addressed. Many of the jobs prohibited for women are in highly paid STEM industries, like mining and manufacturing, and this has real implications on their earning potential. Restrictions on the type of work that women pursue can also hurt firms and their overall competitiveness of an economy, because pool of qualified candidates for open positions is artificially halved, reducing the likelihood of getting the most talented people. The next and last area I want to bring your attention is parenthood. Globally, most countries can improve the leave policies that affect women's options after having children. Parental leave affects the choices women make and the opportunities available to them in the working world. Parental benefits enable mothers, fathers, or both to take paid or unpaid time to care for a newborn child. This in turn can give women greater opportunities for career advancement. Unfortunately, gender norms often hold men back from taking an active role in caring for their babies, and women often face discrimination connected to their roles as mothers. Changing the law is an important first step. In the United States, the state of New York recently reformed laws related to parental leave, giving parents more opportunity to share childcare responsibilities. This leave, however, is still not available at the federal level. Shinjiro Koizumi, a politician in Japan, decided to set precedent and announced that he would take paternity leave. Japan offers fathers 180 days of parental leave, but it is rarely taken. In a country where men have faced discrimination in the workplace and pay cuts because they took paternity leave, Mr. Koizumi's decision is certainly a step in the right direction. Women's equality in the workplace cannot be achieved without men's equality in the home. Today, 105 countries offer some form of paid paternity leaves, but it is on average just 5 days, whereas for women, maternity leave is on average 98 days. The law is a great first step, but we must also know it takes much longer to achieve its meaningful interpretation and implementation. social norms must also change. If women are to qualify for jobs in STEM fields, the lack of essential workplace policies related to childcare, maternity leave, flexible rotations, and work schedules, and sexual harassment policies could further curtail their participation. Thank you.
Taya, thank you so much for that very insightful and informative presentation. A question to follow up for you. You mentioned parental leave policies, and we know that these are very impactful for women and keeping women in the workforce. Can you provide us some insights on why these are so difficult to enact, and to enact beyond, for instance, a 5-day leave policy that you cited? What are the major barriers to enacting these policies that you found?
Well, there are several barriers. One is a financial obligation on the firm, usually to cover the costs. In some countries, the government can pay for it through social insurance or other policies like that, but there is a financial cost to leave. So somebody has to bear the burden, either an insurance policy or the company itself. But we'd really like to change thinking of this as a cost and thinking about it as an investment in your workforce. Another, of course, is social norms, and those are really ingrained in many countries where it is not normal for a man to be home with a baby. It's expected that the mother would stay home, and those are much more difficult to change.
Wonderful, thank you. Now we're going to turn to our second presenter, So-Young Kim.
Thank you for inviting me to share the experience of the Korean government's effort and also the non-profit sector's effort to promote and advance women in STEM fields. In this slide, as shown in the next slide, briefly, I'll just go over some of the legal measures that the Korean government has introduced, and also some of the effort of the organization I'm working with in order to provide some more grassroots effort to set out some goals in promoting women in STEM. And I'll also identify some of the areas that need more progress with some examples of good practices. Okay, in the next slide, you can see all these wonderful efforts by the Korean government in order to promote women in science. Especially in the early 2000s, we had a very, very big law enacted, after which the government set out 4 plans, and the latest plan, which is fourth 5-year plan, is just going on. So as shown the next slide, we have set the several, and just can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So we have set some targets of these plans. So for example, in the third plan, one of the goals, numeric targets, is, for example, 20% of R&D jobs for women in science and technology. And also, for example, in the latest plan, we are aiming to increase the number of female engineering students, share of female engineering students to 30%. But as you can see in the next slide, this one is not going to be workable unless you have organizations that actually implement these legal measures. So we have 3 major organizations in South Korea, more or less. Some are private, partially private, or partially public. And here, although these organizations more or less are collaborating with one another, they have their own areas of specialties. For example, the organization I'm working with, which is Korea Federation of Women's Science and Technology Association, is in fact an organization of organizations compared to the leftmost cell. KWSE is an organization of individual women scientists and engineers. But then, as we go to the next slide, my own organization, which is, as I shown, one of the 3 major organizations of women in STEM, did some great job a few years ago. So let me explain in the next couple of slides. So this long-term roadmap, it's actually the first bottom-up effort of Korean women in science and technology to identify key issues to be addressed in the long run. So as I showed in earlier slides, most efforts so far have been really dominated and driven by the government plans and policies. And as I showed the next slide, this roadmap consists of many individual tasks summed up to higher goals and also the final vision. And the process, as shown in the next slide, it's actually the step also divided into different stages. But the next slide, you can see we had a lot of work in order to prepare this long-term roadmap. So it's not really something that was written on the desk, but rather we just convened many meetings and also listened to the voices of actual women in science and technology, finally coming up with this long-term roadmap. But in the remaining presentation, I'll just go over some of the shortcomings, still areas of progress to be made. So this is a familiar leaky pipeline, and we have, for example, still a small number of female engineering students, and also we still have female employees in STEM fields having really big gender pay gaps and also slow promotion to leadership positions. So I'll just present a couple of statistics showing these gaps. For example, the study that we did last year at the graduate level, you can see female students are more worried about their work-life balance and also career prospects and jobs. And this is quite interesting because in terms of concern with the research performance, there's not much difference between male and female students. So female students are still I guess capable, but then for the other aspects, especially for careers and jobs, female students seem to have more worries. And I'll just go very fast for the remaining slides. So women researchers getting notably lower salaries, especially for permanent and both the permanent and temporary positions. And then the next slide, you can also see there's not much change over the last 10 years in terms of women shares getting small. So women shares getting extremely smaller when career stages are advanced. And also in the next slide, you can see very slow progress of women to higher positions in universities or research institutes. And also the next slide shows you women not only taking a small share of research projects, especially also conducting smaller size compared to male colleagues, smaller size projects. So, and finally, in the next slide, we have an amazing figure, which is the Nobel Prize winners, women winners, roughly 5%, but in Korea, it's actually much smaller, only 0 to 3.6% of major prestigious S&T awards. So in the next few remaining minutes, I'll just present some of the good examples. For example, in the next slide, this is not really limited to STEM, but in our Ministry of Education policy, there is the committee called National University Faculty Gender Equality Committee. I'm also serving as a member of this committee. And as you can see, the monitoring is not simply very qualitative, but rather very specific and very meticulous system of indicators, so that we in fact have been very successful in promoting at least women at the early stages, especially assistant professorships. And then the next slide, you can also see some of the effort to bring back women in science and technology to R&D. And this is not only women researchers, but also organizations such as universities have to also identify who they like to bring back, right? I cannot go much more in detail because of time, but the next slide, the final one. We also have some of the awards encouraging, especially early career women researchers to continue their research and finally land a really stable career track. Since 2010, we have about 80 awardees, and they have been really had a lot of nice research achievements. So finally, I'll just make a few comments, especially on COVID-19 impact. So the first one, oh, by the way, I just forgot to mention this. So we are very familiar with the very typical stereotyping of women engineers and scientists, but we are also sometimes negligent of this subtle discrimination called benevolent sexism, in which women are given just too much favor just because they are viewed as more or less incapable. And also in the next slide, as I said, very interesting survey coming out in May, and nearly half of men saying they are doing most of homeschooling, but only 3% of women agree. So as some of the previous presenters and also speakers mentioned, that COVID-19 seems to be affecting women much more negatively. Okay, thank you very much.
So Young, thank you so much for that very wonderful and insightful presentation. I'm going to pick up on the theme of COVID-19 that we ended with, that you ended with. Are there any practices that you're seeing in South Korea, in the places that you work with, that are taking steps to try to address the more negative impacts of COVID-19 on women and women in STEM in particular?
Well, one good sign of change, I guess, is previously women, because of childcare, although they might want to stay home and work at home, we had a very, very strong opposition to work at home. But because of COVID-19, somehow women researchers, like other women in other jobs, are working at home and not necessarily being viewed as getting lazy or not doing work much. So in terms of staying home and working at home, in fact, unlike this New York Times article, this is also, I guess, is the same for the Korean women, but at least we have a very dramatic change in the perceptions of work at home, so that women researchers, especially when they have to work outside and also very late at home, very late at night, they still can go back home and then don't need to come back to the labs unless you really work in a very, very in a wet lab, but still you can very freely choose wherever you want to work. So that's good news, but there is not particular measure or a policy measure to really encourage more homes, at home work.
Thank you. So so it sounds like one silver lining coming from the COVID pandemic, but still much more work to do, especially in the policy realm. Thank you so much. I want to just remind the audience that please, we would like to hear the questions that you have for the panelists. So please be sure to type those in to the Q&A section. And we will be sure to answer your questions. We do have a lot of time dedicated for questions and discussion with our panelists once we hear from our final speaker. And I will turn now to introducing our final speaker, Kathy Matsui. Kathy, please take it away.
Thanks, Karen, and it's a pleasure to join this panel. I've learned a great deal so far, so really appreciate the chance to participate. I'm going to talk about Japan from more of a macro perspective. I'm not working in a STEM arena, unlike my two other fellow panelists, but I would like to share with you, from my vantage point, what we've observed in terms of the progress in what I call womenomics, a concept that I coined 21 years ago as part of my research in Japan. Share a little bit about what some of the obstacles to greater gender diversity are, and then talk a little bit about where I see us going in future. So as you can see here, this is our simulation of what if Japan could not only close its gender employment gap, which historically, one of the reasons I wrote this wrote about Womenomics 21 years ago is because I'm an equity strategist. I have investors asking me, Japan has a huge amount of fiscal debt. Its population is shrinking. There's in fact more registered dogs and cats than there are children under the age of 15. Japan is going to see its workforce shrink by a massive 40% within the next 35 years. And we all know that there are only three drivers of any economy's growth, which is labor, capital, and productivity. So I've written these research pieces over the last 2 decades, and my latest one, Womenomics 5.0, I did this analysis. So for example, what if Japan could close its gender employment gap? And on top of that, what if more women could work fuller time jobs? And the combination of those two things is the dark blue column on the right. You see that Japan's GDP, which is upwards of 5 trillion US dollars, could be boosted by as much as 15%, which of course is not insignificant. So like what was mentioned earlier about South Korea, our countries with historically very large gender employment gaps have a lot to gain. Next slide, please. So what's happened? Well, remarkably, since I started my research, where Japan was clearly kind of in last place, so to speak, when it comes to female labor participation, that is, Japan is the red line. In the last 7+ years, Japan has actually shot up, exceeding both the United States and Europe in terms of female labor participation. We're now at about 72%. The U.S. is next at 67%. It's actually fallen over the last several years, and the Eurozone is about 63%. So the good news is that many more women in Japan are working outside the home. In fact, 3.3 million jobs have been created for women, and that's been terrific to see. However, this of course does mask another reality, which is over half of Japanese women working outside the home are working in part-time roles as opposed to full-time ones. So if you turn to the next slide, you can see where we really have a huge amount of work cut out for us is Japan still faces a dearth of female leaders. If you look at the dark blue bar, that is the female manager ratio, less than half the equivalents in the United States and Europe. And of course, board directors also extremely low in the single digit, territory. Let's also not forget the public sector, where in Japan's lower house of parliament, Japan has seen a pretty flat percentage of female parliamentarians in the lower house at about 10% for quite some time. And so if you think about 10%, well, in the context of the world, that is lower than Saudi Arabia and Libya. So to me, this underrepresentation of women in the key decision-making roles in this country is not healthy, and we really have a lot to do to address this. And I think that to the polling question at the start of our session, I was intrigued by the results that said that, one thing that is maybe a stumbling block for women in STEM is the social, mores and the social expectations around this concept. And I think that is so important, particularly here in Japan. If you turn to the next slide, I've written a little bit about what I call the myths of womenomics. And this might be relevant for some of you in other parts of Asia and the United States, but this was a survey conducted by an NPO in the United States several years ago of thousands of women in Japan, in the United States, and Europe. And what they did was ask women who had left the workforce after they gave birth to a child, why did you leave? And they bucketed these reasons. One on the left was pull factors like childcare, elder care, and on the right was push factors, unsatisfying career, feeling stalled. And interestingly, this is just looking at the comparison between Japanese respondents, which is the dark blue, and light blue, which is American women. And interestingly, I thought on the pull factors on the left side, American women cited childcare much more than Japanese women. But then you go to the right side, and it turns out that Japanese women cited factors related to stalled careers, not seeing much upside or forward as a greater reason for leaving than, say, American women. And I cite this. The point I'm trying to make here is that we can talk all we want about let's push the government to provide more daycare capacity, to change the tax code, to do all these things. But even if that is perfect, we still have an unaddressed issue, which is what is happening within organizations? Who is mentoring these women? Who is managing their careers? What is happening in that realm? So I think we can't forget that while I know this is discussion on the legal and regulatory environment, we also need to discuss, or can't forget, what's happening within organizations as well. And secondly, next page is, I still encounter, and I hope this is not an issue with anybody on this call, but believe me, I have people ask me, does this even matter? Does gender diversity actually matter for performance? And this is the Catalyst survey. I know it's very well known. It's taking the Fortune 500 companies, looking at companies with 3 or more WBD or women board directors in the red versus those with 0 in the blue. And in both ROE and ROIC comparisons, profitability rises with more diverse management. Next slide, please. We also looked at Japanese companies in isolation that score high on diversity metrics, and we found the same, result in terms of performance as well. Next slide. And so turning to recommendations, I know I said that, government can't do everything, but there's still, some way to go. But what I want to also stress is that the government, what I showed you earlier about the extraordinary rise in female labor participation, this wasn't just like coincidental. The government has actually made some interesting changes. So for instance, in 2015, the government adopted a law where every organization with at least 300 employees have to disclose gender-related statistics and set diversity goals. Now, it's a little bit random. You can kind of disclose whatever you want, but there is a legal requirement now. And because of this, the world's largest pension fund, which is the Japanese National Pension Fund, GPIF, managed to invest in a women's empowerment index, which is made of stocks like what I just showed you earlier. And the only reason they were able to do this was because of this new disclosure requirement. As we all know, you cannot manage what you can't measure. And so I think this transparency component was very, very critical to making this work. I think what more that we need to do, as I've written here, gender pay gap disclosures. I know this is a universal topic, but the other thing that the government did here was to pass a law very recently on equal pay for equal work. I mentioned earlier that women in Japan, most of them are working part-time, not full-time, and there's a lot of, I would call, abuse, meaning that a part-time person, their job content could actually be identical to the full-time person next to them, but they just have to be on a part-time contract. So I think changing that is one first step, and we shall see how that's going to be enforced. Just 1 minute left in my presentation. You can skip 2 slides forward. One more back, sorry. 2 tailwinds that make me optimistic. Number 1 is ESG investment is exploding everywhere, but it is growing the fastest in Japan. This is the growth in UN PRI, Principles of Responsible Investing, signatories in the country. Japan is the fastest growing ESG market. So I work in capital markets. There's not a day that goes by when a client is not asking us how to measure ESG. Remember, gender diversity comes right into the S and the G here. So this is very, very powerful. Last slide is on values. I don't know about all of you, but in my company, Goldman Sachs, 70% of my colleagues are millennials or Gen Z. This is a survey by the Japanese government asking single men, who do you aspire for your partner in the future? The orange is housewife, the dark blue is working woman. And see how this has flipped. It's interesting because my young male colleagues in Japan used to never ask me about work-life balance. And today I probably get more questions from the men than I do from the women. So I think this is so powerful, healthy, and I think COVID has actually brought this home even further. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that we'll all together lead to change for the better. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you so much. A really compelling presentation, and I love that you ended on an optimistic note to give us all something, some great hope to hang on to. My question for you, I was struck, and I think others from the U.S. might be as well. about the disclosure requirements that you mentioned in Japan, and as you point out, they're not perfect. But how important do you think that is that transparency is to the gains that Japan has made in women in the labor force? And do you have any suggestions for environments where targets are either unlawful or not promoted? Are there other actions that organizations can take to increase transparency in the absence of that regulation?
Sure. So I can tell you, because I had been involved in the actual formulation of these discussions for many, many years, and there was enormous pushback in the beginning. Companies complained, oh, it's costly, it's useless, we have other things we need to prioritize, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the government said, look, we need to move that needle. And if we have no idea where that needle lies, we're not going to move that needle, right? So let's figure out where we are. And with basically healthy competition, I think most economies in Asia and probably the United States as well, if company A sets a goal of 30% female managers by 2030, and its competitor sets a goal of 20%, well, we all know it's a war for talent out there. And if you're a young woman trying to pick between companies A and B, you probably look at company A because it looks like it's a better environment for your career long term, right? And so I think whether it's legally binding or it's just a guidance, that really depends on the particular country. But I think in Japan's case, they decided without forcing this, there was never going to be any real progress. So it's been very interesting to talk to CEOs here because they're now very competitive. And sometimes I think in many cases with human behavior, shame and embarrassment can go a long way.
Thank you. I again will remind our audience that we have plenty of time for Q&A, so please do get your questions into the Q&A box. You can type those in. We'll be working through those. I just want to offer just a few words of reflection on these three absolutely incredible presentations. I think one of the themes that we saw weaving throughout each of these presentations is that the policies and regulations in our three countries have certainly made a difference in the positive for women, and in particular for women in STEM fields. Yet there is still work to be done. There's work to be done at the local level. There's work to be done at the global level. And in places where we have seen some gains, we have also seen numbers slip back. We heard about engineering, certainly the case in computer science, and in some of the mathematics and physical sciences fields, we are still seeing, we're still seeing the retraction of women going into those fields. So our policies have helped, but there's still a lot of work to be done. We also have I think seen that we know some of the practices that help encourage and support women in the workforce and certainly attract them to get them into the jobs. But we're not seeing widespread adoption in all cases of those practices. And I think very important, there is a clear need to continue to support women through their careers and into leadership positions, paying close attention to career fulfillment for women and career trajectories of women. So I think these three talks really gave us a lot to think about in this space. And I'm going to turn now to a couple of questions. We have a question from Melinda Pavak, and she says, the work that people do in the home is not valued in GDP calculations. How could making a change in this statistic help to change the perceived value of these roles women have traditionally held? And I'll open that up to any of our panelists who'd like to respond.
Well, I'll just kick it off. I received that comment or question many times in the past, and I think it's an excellent question. It's unpaid work. We all know that it is extraordinarily valuable. I think the challenge, of course, is how do economists and other people like that attach a value, a dollar or a yen or won figure to that labor, so to speak. So I would hope that at some point somebody could do that, and but I think that is absolutely crucial, because until we attach a value to what I call this asset that I think is extraordinarily crucial, obviously, for economic growth and sustainability everywhere in this world. I think it's going to be hard to say, okay, you know, what are these? What is half the population, or many of them who are perhaps working more at home? What are they actually contributing to society? So I'm totally with that. I don't know the answer to it, but I think that is an excellent point, and we need to move forward on that.
Taya or Soyoung, would you like to respond or add to that?
Well, in fact, in South Korea, just a couple of years ago, the government tried a tentative statistical scheme to include housework. So this is not formal, but they try to measure the value of a housework. And as I remember at the time, the traditional statistics shows the contribution of women and men more or less towards the men, because men usually are single bread or major breadwinner. But then when the women's housework was counted, the percentage of contribution in fact increased. But this, as I said, this is pilot study, not formal yet, but it increased from roughly lower than 50, but more about 60 to 70%. So you can see once we include this into official statistics, maybe much of the major government statistics has to be changed. So that's maybe one of the reasons why it just stopped there as a pilot project.
If I can add to that, I think we have been hearing in discussions on statistics and data in the World Bank and with other organizations that work on this, some talk about how can we value this aspect. And, you know, during COVID, I can tell you, for example, in my family, I used to pay someone who cleaned the house. I used to pay someone who took care of my children. You know, there was GDP contributions for housework that now, because of COVID lockdowns, I'm doing it myself. So it's impacting my work and my time. And that money is actually getting taken out of GDP calculations because it was paid work and now it's unpaid work. And so, you know, I think we can find a way to measure it. There is one data point that we collect in our study, which is whether the law provides for the valuation of non-monetary contributions when it comes to, you know, property division between spouses. And that, I think, is also an interesting maybe way to look at how that non-monetary contributions are valued when it comes to divorce and property, to really account for that contributions that certain spouses, whether it's male or female, make if they stay home.
Thank you. We have another question that I'm going to open to all panelists. And this question is, what changes have you made in your approach to mitigate factors that hinder women in STEM during COVID, and how has this influenced policies?
I could go first this time. So in our work, you know, we collect data and we're researchers, and we were starting our data collection just as everyone was going into lockdowns back in March and April. And so we usually survey legal experts in 190 countries, and we ask them questions about the labor law, family laws, constitutions, how laws protect women against violence. And as we were experiencing this pandemic, we started asking, are these laws changing? Is anything specifically being done either temporarily or permanently to change policies and laws to address women's issues, but also just issues coming out of the pandemic? And what we're finding is that there are lots of policies that are being implemented, some temporarily and some more permanently, but the issues that are coming up are around paid leave to take care of family members, child care options for essential workers, but also non-essential workers, and access to justice. So what happens when you are on lockdowns, when courts are closed? How can you enforce your legal rights? And so countries are changing even sometimes laws to allow for virtual court hearings, to be able to access certain courts or their rights through virtual means. And so this is opening kind of a more innovative way of accessing these rights, but is also showing certain new gender gaps in access to technology or to internet. And so I think we're still learning, but we are collecting a lot of new information on what policies are being done and what's working and what's not working. So hopefully we'll have some new research to share on that soon.
Well, the South Korean government has been providing some monetary assistance, monetary help to especially mothers having elementary and also, I guess it's elementary and preschools, not middle or high schools, because these elementary and elementary students and also preschoolers, they stay mostly at home once these places are closed, so that women are taking care of more their children most of the time. So the government started to distributing some kind of voucher so that the mothers can use to send them to very small group, because we have to social distance, so very small group of children who can stay of a couple of hours outside. That's just a very small effort for the government to help women very negatively affected by COVID-19. But something that I found over the last few days after I sent my presentation is, in fact, COVID-19 after the outbreak, it's around February, some research articles showed that women researchers are kind of disappearing from journal as the first author of the journals articles, so that some pilot study compared the first authors and then the share of women, in fact, has been decreasing since February. Although this must be fully studied again, it shows especially women researchers, although they can stay home, but still they have to take care of both research and also child care, so that increasingly women are not really doing their research work, especially as the first author. So that's another very worrisome trend.
Just a couple of points from my side. I think that what's been interesting to observe here in Japan is that the pandemic kind of forced open some of the obstacles, or forced away some of the obstacles to deregulation. And that, for example, telemedicine was essentially illegal in Japan. The doctors' lobby, very powerful, vehemently opposed to that kind of interface with patients. Well, thanks to COVID, it's no longer illegal. And in fact, they thought it would be temporary, but now it looks like they're going to extend the access, the accessibility of this for most Japanese people under the national health system. So I think for a lot of women, parents, families, this is huge. So I would say that's one other silver lining. And I also think that the new government under Prime Minister Suga, he is trying to push forward an agenda on making Japan basically more productive overall. And one of the initiatives is he's established a digital agency. It's still early days to understand exactly what the remit of this agency will be, but I'm hopeful that it will not only tackle what are very analog processes in the Japanese government from a day-to-day perspective, but more importantly, really address the gap in STEM education, particularly digital literacy amongst teachers. Although Japan has this perception of being very technologically advanced, it is in some ways, but in other ways it lags very much behind. And so I think in particular in elementary, middle, high school levels, giving teachers the ability, or teaching teachers digital literacy, and encouraging young girls and women to pursue that beyond secondary school, I think is going to be absolutely key. So that's what I'm encouraging the Japanese government to do. We shall see where that takes us. But that, to me, wouldn't have happened without COVID. So that's, I think, another silver lining.
And we have a question from a participant for Kathy. What strategies can employees or potential employees take to effectively shame employers to improving practices and commitments?
Well, I don't know if I'd encourage deliberate strategies to shame your employers, but I think that to the extent that you can encourage your employer, if that's what you're talking about, to really start to assess where do you stand with respect to diverse staffing. What are you doing on the recruiting front? We have a diversity slate requirement at Goldman, so for any experienced higher position, we can't extend an offer letter unless we've actually interviewed at least not one, but two. It's now Goldman speak, that's not just women, but it's LGBT, it's minority groups, etc. But if you don't make it a systematic part of your process for recruitment, retention, and promotion, nothing really changes in our view. But by assessing where you stand and then putting together some aspirational goals, they don't have to be hard targets, but goals, of course, A, that sends a signal to the world that you're serious, and B, it holds the management accountable for reaching those goals, right? And I think by doing so, you can put yourself out there. Of course, then everybody will say, okay, what are your competitors doing? And I think that's kind of a healthy first or helpful first step in my opinion. So I think there are many strategies. I wrote this book. It's unfortunately only available in Japanese. I published this summer, but it does talk about some of these micro strategies within organizations that can be pursued to make progress on that front.
Fantastic, thank you. We might need to get that book translated into some other languages. We have another question from Suyako, and the question is, how is the child care policy getting formed to help women out after COVID-19? And I think this refers to artificial intelligence and AI progress. I'm assuming that means the future of work and how that will be defined with AI, especially in the US, but certainly in all countries.
But it seems part of that question was already discussed just previously. So AI progress is not addressed yet, but the first part, we addressed that.
With child care policies, yes. Yeah. So can you all think about, and hopefully I'm framing this correctly, so I hope I am, but certainly in the U.S., we have been talking a lot about what jobs will be changing, what jobs will be drifting away as a result of advances in artificial intelligence, and how does that in particular influence women, and what policies might need to be put into place for women as a result of the progress in AI?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, in 2016, the World Economic Forum published a report, very famous, The Future of Jobs, and there they found women to be more negatively affected. So the job loss would be more serious for women, especially because of women underrepresented in computing-related jobs, and also many of the simple repetitive tasks are something that women are doing. As already Kathy mentioned, the women tend to be employed in temporary positions, and these types of work tend to be more or less the same, which can be replaced by robots or AI processes, so that women are more vulnerable to the job replacement or displacement by AI progresses. And that means that's also related to the very common trend across countries in which women are, even among engineering fields, still in computing, especially, women are much more underrepresented. So that implies that we need to do a lot more, really, to bring more women into computing. And as our senator also mentioned earlier, she also experienced herself that, especially in the computing-related jobs, that women are extremely scarce. And even in Silicon Valley, there is also cultural bias, and also more as outright sexual harassment also going on, and as we hear in many reports. So there is much more work to be done both by the government and also by corporations, especially giant tech companies, to promote women. Not only bring more women, but also devise some of the applications less that would be less gender biased.
If I can just add to my previous answer, what we've seen, one is introduction of paid family leave, either partially or fully paid, and increasing the allowances for paid family leave. And we've seen that in the United States and Korea introduced that. We also have seen ensuring that certain childcare services are available to essential workers so that essential workers can continue to work. And the third is financial subsidies for childcare. So those are the three kind of different measures that we've been seeing countries implementing, but also at the firm level, not just what governments are doing, but companies are also increasing their allowances for family leave, also allowing more flexible schedules, making sure that when their school days off, that they're allowing their employees to work from home. I mean, we're seeing a bit more trends also on the side of the companies to be more flexible with the work during COVID, and hopefully that will stay beyond as well.
And I'll just add, I think that one critical piece to assuring that our entire societies are going to be equipped with this, not just AI, but a whole wave of technological advancements, is to ensure that our girls and women are exposed and educated sufficiently to have those digital skills, or whatever you want to call that, to be equipped to, they don't have to be, having PhDs in STEM fields, but to know the lingo. My daughter's in university and she's definitely not in the STEM arena. She's in more of the humanities, but she said, Mom, every speaker comes to campus is saying that we need to learn how to code. And so she's now minoring in computer programming. And she probably will never be a computer programmer, but by understanding the lingo, the jargon, I think, frankly, whatever industry you look at is going to be absolutely essential. So having that exposure at an early stage, I think, incorporating that into curricula for governments everywhere, I think is going to be very, very necessary. And the other thing also I want to add, somewhat related to this, is promoting female entrepreneurs. I think it's one thing to try to change, behemoth organizations that have been around for hundreds of years, but frankly, in this new dynamic, absolutely lightning speed changing world that we live in, where we don't actually know what is going to happen to the jobs that exist today, the importance of just understanding that change and giving women the tools, whether it's access to credit, whether it's creating networks. We all know there's a big entrepreneurial gender gap pretty much everywhere in the world. But hopefully if we can empower these women to give them courage, give them capital, give them networks, give them tools to succeed, then they can be the job creators. They can control their destinies. And I've written a lot about that in Japan. I think there's a huge opportunity in most of Asia, obviously the United States as well. But I think that's an area we should not neglect, which is promoting female entrepreneurs to cope with that fast-changing world we're entering.
Excellent points. Thank you all. We have a question from Melinda for Kathy. How much of the workplace dissatisfaction shown by Japanese women is a reflection of the messages they get from society regarding the high value of motherhood? And do you think that it is a social comparison issue rather than real dissatisfaction? And I'm hoping that our other panelists can also reflect on this question and respond from the South Korea and U.S. perspective.
So I think that is correct. There is some of the social norms or mores that influence or frankly put pressure on Japanese women when they're in the workplace, particularly when they have children, that they just feel they're not doing their job as a mother 100%, or they're being told that they're neglecting their children, all of these things I think put together are part of that. But I also think part of it is we must remember that companies, the employers, if they want to retain this talent, particularly if they're high potential for that organization, they need to do a lot of work themselves as well. So for instance, in my book, I encourage employers to think about their I call it high potential talent pool, and offer them stretch assignments before critical life events occur. Because I think oftentimes, especially in many Japanese traditional organizations where it's essentially seniority-based, performance evaluation, so it's the time factor. The longer you are, ultimately you'll get to a managerial post. But if you're only measured on that, then it's very demotivating, I think, particularly for women, for other minority groups, because they just don't have that time. And so I think changing the evaluation system is also super critical to encouraging more women to stay in their careers longer. But at the end of the day, we are all human beings. And as I wrote in my book, women in particular, I think, need to feel that they're needed, that they have a future, that they have a career forward. Women, we all know, have a confidence gap. I know many of my female direct reports never utter the word promotion because they're afraid to do so, right? For fear of being viewed as political or self-promoting. Well, I tell them, you know what? Guys do it so well, and they do it so often. And so if that's, the reality that we're all living in, and we want both men and women to thrive, managers need to be very sensitized to that. I talk also about how women interpret performance feedback versus men. I don't know about all of you, but I find women who are first quartile performers, all they take away from the review meeting is the one or two tiny, constructive criticisms at the end. All the positive stuff has left their ear. Whereas the guys tend to make it flip, right? They kind of de-emphasize the negatives and they only cling to the positives. Or promotion opportunities. They only say, oh, there's 10 criteria needed for success. The guys will say, I've got 3 of the 10, I'm ready. Because those are the most important criteria. The women say, I've got 8 of the 10. I don't have all 10. I'm clearly not ready, right? So all these things that I think are just, that's how we're wired. It's nobody's fault. But I think we have to be sensitive. We have to educate our managers and employers that this is how the world works, or how the world is. And we need to do unconscious bias training and just put in the time, put in the effort, because unless you feel you invest in the high potential talent that you have, it's very easy for these women to say, hey, I don't see my future, and I just see or I'm feeling other pulls or other forces pulling me in another direction. So it's very important to look at this comprehensively.
Well, I don't know how this is going to compare with Japan, but South Korea and also China and Japan or Vietnam have all these common Confucian traditions, so that we have this culture of deference to the elderly, and also all this emphasis on women's roles as really good mothers. But it seems, at least in South Korea, we have been seeing a dramatic change in such perceptions and norms, and especially millennials. They don't look like Koreans in a sense. I mean, traditional Koreans. They are almost like just Westerners, and we have increasingly singles. Those people not simply not getting married, but intentionally opting to be unmarried, so that they just stay as a single household, single member household. So in a sense, I guess we have we are seeing some big changes in terms of expectations of women as mothers or child caregivers. But at the same time, what I have noticed is there are very clear organizational differences across different sizes of firms. So in Korea, for instance, Samsung or LG, these are global companies. So their female workers, especially mid-career, they don't really, they might, but still, they don't really face outright discrimination, and their female workers are as confident in themselves as maybe male workers. But then mid-sized and also small and medium-sized enterprises, it's almost like 20 years ago. Still, although legally they should get maternity leave, but still, once they take it, they are more or less pressured to leave forever. So that's a very sad reality of corporate environment now. I guess that's probably the same maybe in other countries.
I think in the United States, the lack of a national policy on unpaid family leave and the lack of affordable childcare does influence women's decision to leave the labor force often. But I do think some of it stems back to certain entrenched discrimination and the paid wage and the gender wage gap. Because, if you're choosing one person to stay home to take care of children or the elderly or for whatever reason, the person that will leave their job is the one that brings less money into the family. It's an economics issue at the end of the day. And we're seeing it so much now with COVID because families are having to choose to leave their jobs, and it's often going to be the one that earns less. And so I do think that influences as well women's decisions when they're entering the workforce and how they progress. And we've seen research often that women will, even when they're starting to plan for a baby, not take really big projects. They'll think, okay, in 9 months I want to have a baby, so I'm not going to take this project that will take a year. Or managers are keeping them away from opportunities because they see, oh, she just had a baby, she's not going to take a work trip going somewhere. And so they're preventing them from really pursuing certain actions that will get them that promotion or make them more qualified for their next job. And so there is, I think, a bias happening on both sides, both from the managers and the workers, where they are sort of ahead of time already stopping to do certain things.
Well, I want to thank our phenomenal panelists, Taya, So-Young, and Kathy, for sharing your invaluable work and experiences with us. Thank you to our audience for joining us today for this important discussion. And lastly, thank you to our interpreters for their important work behind the scenes. We encourage you to continue the conversation and to network with other STEM professionals by joining the STEM Trilateral Slack group and engaging with us on social media. And now we're looking forward to the next panel, Gender Norms in STEM, Family Decision-Making, the Unpaid Care Burden, and the Challenges and Benefits of Creating Diverse Teams, which will get started in just a few minutes. Thank you, everyone.